And today we have for you, very excited for today. We have, of course, all the themes across these days have tremendous overlap with them, but today in particular, we're focusing on Indigenous data sovereignty and how we look to center justice in this work, and not keeping in mind and holding true to what we you mentioned yesterday, reflecting back what Dr. Redsteer shared on the first day of how we can't really, how can we talk about this if it's not about justice? So bringing us to the point where that doesn't even have to be said. That's just innate. Um, and just a world of gratitude to the folks who are going to be speaking today, who are the leaders really in this work and showing us all the way forward. And so we'll be starting off with the wonderful keynote presentation today by Dr. Dominique David-Chavez, and moving into a fantastic panel of speakers going into our World Cafe session for today, where there's some new organizations and programs joining us, some that some that have been there the last couple days that you haven't gone to talk to, and some new ones today, and then followed by continuing kind of that heartbeat in the work of this workshop, right? It's a workshop. There's a key word there in that, and so we're all here to collectively do really the first half of that word, and we'll be in our working groups together and reflecting on some of what's come to pass in conversations. With that, it is my deep pleasure to turn this over to the one, the only, Mr. Bill Thomas. Aloha, sir. Thank you.
Mahalo, Julie. Talofa. Afade, kia ora, aloha, everyone. Good morning. Kukuya, mahalos for such a beautiful opening for today and reminding us of the importance of what we do, but the importance of the heart in what we do and the importance of love, because this is not just, it's not a labor of love that we do. This is something that we love to do, and it is important. And it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote, Dr. Dominique David-Chavez. I've had the honor and privilege of working with her for several years now, and many of us have known her over a period of time for being somebody that's pioneered a lot of work. And it reminds us that sometimes we say time flies when you're having fun, or sometimes they say time's fun when you're having flies. I'm not quite sure sometimes what it is, but I don't think it's time that really flies, but time actually reminds us of how precious these moments are and how honored we are to have everyone in our presence here. But also the vital importance of our gatherings are to share all of the knowledge that we have, to share the love that we have for each other and for the things that we do. And Dominique is somebody who I think embodies all of that. And for those who haven't had the honor and privilege of working with her and knowing her for, like many of us have had, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about her, and she'll speak a lot more in her own words, much more eloquently than I can. But Dominique is a multicultural Caribbean Indigenous Taino Arawak research scientist, educator, mentor, learner, mother, and community member. She currently serves as an assistant professor of Indigenous Natural Resource Stewardship in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship at Colorado State University, where she leads the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Interdisciplinary Research Lab and works in partnership with the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance. In both her scholarship and practice, she holds an intergenerational commitment towards supporting culturally grounded community members, including youth elders, educators and farmers as researchers, restoring pathways for knowledge regeneration with the original stewards of Indigenous knowledge systems and lands in which they are embedded. Her work supports Indigenous governance in environmental research and decision-making, community-based climate resilience research in the Caribbean islands and Western US, excuse me, and Indigenous science education. Her academic training includes a PhD in human dimensions of natural resources and a Bachelor's of Science in Earth Science. So these, as far as I'm concerned, are words on a piece of paper, and Dominique can actually put those words into not just action, but to bring the spirit of who she is to all of us. Dominique, I'd like to turn it to you. Thank you.
Home, thank you, Uncle Bill Thomas, and for your mentorship on behalf of our research lab too. And Mabrika, welcome to everyone today who's joining us. I just want to say home, thank you to all of you for being here, for your work, this collective work we're a part of. And I know there's an immense amount of hard work on behalf of the coordinators to bring us together. So I also wish to give my thanks to you all. And today we're here to reflect on Indigenous data sovereignty for centering justice. So thank you for allowing me to steer our canoe in this direction for a portion of our morning or afternoon for some of you. And I just want to share too what a beautiful experience it has been. I've been a part of the Rising Voices community for 6 years now. And to have an opportunity to listen to an Arakoala elder and knowledge keeper from my own community open this space with breath and with ceremony has been like a dream to see this happening. So hahom kukuya for bringing us in that way. And it's also been a dream to see all of amongst the rising voices, how many youth, how many elders, how many community knowledge keepers and matriarchs there are this year. And I just wanted to share my excitement around that. And in light of our theme, I'll be guiding us towards a shared understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty today. I'll share a story from my own Caribbean Indigenous community around our climate resilience work to contextualize the role of this work within our Indigenous ancestral and settler colonial experiences. And I'll be subjecting you to some of my PowerPoint art for portions of this. And lastly, I'll share some critical resources to help us further enact Indigenous data sovereignty for our shared futures, for our shared lifeways. And so I also want to just share that I'll be the voice carrying these messages and these resources to you today. However, this represents the efforts of many more voices and really collective efforts, and including some of the slides I'll share. I owe credit to collaborators at the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, some of whom will be on the panel following this talk, and the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, or GIDA, for contributing to this keynote. And I'd like to take a moment, since we're in this public space, to formally honor somebody who's been a very special part of my journey, Dr. Stephanie Russo Carroll, who will also be part of the panel, and just to share this honoring of Stephanie, as Stephanie mentored me through my Indigenous Data Sovereignty postdoctoral fellowship and mentors many of us Indigenous scholars and data warriors in a very unique and culturally grounded way. And I wouldn't be able to articulate this work as clearly as I hope to, and through the language of sovereignty, without the immense work that Dr. Carroll has shared. So home, Stephanie, let's all take a moment to honor this amazing person too, while we're here for this gathering. And so with that, I want to open us first with this foundational understanding that speaks to the origin of Indigenous data sovereignty movement, which is that our people have always been data stewards. For thousands of years, our data has lived in stories and song, in dance, in the art forms that my sister Paulette spoke to earlier, in traditions and customs and protocols, in prayer and in practice, encoded in a variety of forms, such as the Kipu Kumulipo, our cosmology stories, winter counts, totem poles, our petroglyphs, and wampum and star charts that we hold across our communities. And our data holds observations of space, time, and being, of change and duality that is generations in the making. So data in this way is also our relations to which we hold relational responsibilities, something that Uncle Bill Thomas is reminding us of during our data analysis meetings too around this work. So this includes responsibilities to the knowledge systems, to the information, and to the communities for whom data generates impacts. So with that, let's look at what are Indigenous data. And in our current era, Indigenous data takes many new forms too. So this includes data about our natural environments and our more than human natural relatives. This includes information about us as individuals, so census data, demographic data, public health data, and genetic data, and also collectively generated and held data, including our Indigenous knowledge systems, our stories, and our oral histories. So Indigenous data sovereignty then is the inherent right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. And it's as rooted in sovereignty, only Indigenous nations and peoples can enact Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty carries responsibilities, customs, and roles regarding how to steward and use community-held knowledge and information. And Indigenous data sovereignty draws from human rights frameworks, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties, laws, policies, and formal agreements. And lastly, affirms the collective rights of Indigenous peoples regarding data stewardship. So together, these aspects work to restore authority over Indigenous data back to Indigenous peoples. And bringing this into climate science realm, which many of us are working in and speaking to through this work in Rising Voices, while high-level climate science forums, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is quoted here, are recognizing now for a number of years now the involvement of local and Indigenous ways of knowing, the importance of that involvement and those knowledge systems for climate adaptation. We have further to reach to ensure critical data needs are met for Indigenous governance and for self-determined decision-making. And this is something I learned a lot more about during my doctoral research. And some of you, if you were back at Rising Voices 5, might remember a poster session where I shared some of this research. This is in assessing 20 years of field studies that were accessing Indigenous knowledge and data for climate research, which included 125 field studies across 140 publications. I found that nearly 9 out of 10 studies demonstrate extractive research methods, meaning community knowledge holders, decision makers, and rights holders do not have authority in those cases to determine what research questions are asked, how data is collected, how data is maintained and disseminated, and in many cases even have access to the study findings from those climate studies. And yet a growing number of studies, including numerous grassroots efforts, including Indigenous community-led and intercultural efforts, live at this end of the scale, where they're exercising Indigenous research and data governance and self-determined community engagement. So this is really the shift that we're looking for, that we're working for to move from this dominant, what I'll call colonial model of science that is this pattern of extractive research toward the self-determined edge of the scale. And let's look for a moment at the justice implications of this historic imbalance through the lens of a specific community context and history. And so again, I'll welcome you, Mabrica, to the Indigenous Caribbean, my maternal homeland. And it's here where the forces of Huracan, including Hurricane Maria, depicted here, has shaken awake the ancestral memories and data banks of many of our community members. And as our speakers from the first day of this year's workshop acknowledged, Indigenous peoples have been observing and adapting to climate change for centuries. These knowledges and data are embedded often in our cosmology stories, in our creation stories, which is why here or in the Caribbean, long before we knew Maria or Irma or Harvey, Katrina or Sandy, we knew their mother and matriarch, Guabanse, who's depicted here. And you can see Huracan and their form being born in this carving from Guabanse's belly. However, it's not only the form which our ancestors have observed of Huracan, there's also an understanding that Guabanse doesn't work alone. From her skyward home, she urges the thunder songs of Guataba and invites the surging swell of Coatrisque, and in that way drawing energy from the ocean and summoning the mixing of dual forces. So these are our Indigenous Caribbean sciences, earth sciences. These are our understandings of oceanic and atmospheric forces. And it's also through these original data sources and understandings that we can remember Huracan as bringing forth a new cycle, not only of destruction, but also of renewal. And this teaching of duality was something I was excited to hear our elder and knowledge keeper Kukuya speak to during yesterday's poster walk. And during our opening day too, something that the panel really spoke to about how long we've been holding our own earth science knowledge and data. So this is our legacy. It's handed down from one generation to the next, encoded in many forms of data, in story and song and dance and art form, especially in our community. And yet our relationship to that data, our relationship to those stories and to that legacy have suffered severe injustices via, in the case of Puerto Rican, or the island more recently known as Puerto Rico, in the case of 2 waves of colonization. And that manifests in ways that we need to really be attentive to understand and how to address justice in this case. So in this NPR report that I'm sharing, it was something I read and was listening to following in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria that really struck me, because rural families in this article were referenced as squatters, having been denied FEMA aid due to lack of legal title to the homes and lands which they cared for, and which in turn have cared for them for generations. And this interview quote that I share here and the story really revealed the disconnect between customary rights and practices and relationships and climate relief policy. However, to truly understand how it is, and I think we need to understand how is it that descendants of Indigenous peoples can be referenced as squatters on their ancestral land, how they can be continually displaced and even criminalized in many cases on their ancestral land. To understand this, I think we need to look deeper at the roots of contemporary injustices such as these. And in doing so, when we follow those threads, those symptoms of vulnerability, for example, they bring us back to this direct connection between the legacy of settler colonialism and the marginalization and vulnerability that's forced upon Indigenous and local peoples who are naturally climate adaptive, strong peoples by nature, as I described, and as others have spoken to. And in this way, data has really been used to fuel the paper genocide of our peoples, the physical genocide and the paper genocide of our peoples, through suppression of Indigenous self-identification in the census records, and through colonial narratives that have been overriding Indigenous language and legacies of land stewardship for a long time now. And regarding the intergenerational transmission of our Indigenous knowledges and data, we've also seen these injustices continue even today when our children are subjected to colonial education systems, when they are turned away from their data relations and responsibilities. And in terms of that dominancy of extractive research that I shared with you from that systematic review study. And this is something I experienced in my own education, and now I'm seeing repeated in my children's education in public school. So when our own children also, when they have to access their Indigenous data through revisions and often misguidings of foreign narrators, and I think any Indigenous scholar or community member who might be listening today, they might know that familiar sick feeling in your belly that I've felt before when you're reading what has been written about our communities, when you're seeing the data that has been really informing policy and practice today, that has been written and collected by authors and researchers lacking love and lacking relational accountability to our land, to our lifeways, to our communities. And so we've witnessed the results of generation after generation denied their inherent rights to data sovereignty, but we're also witnessing something new and something hopeful, which is that as long as we remember the depth and the strength of our roots, we will remain connected both to land and to our community collectives. And it's through our roots, both figurative and literal, that we often find resilience, that resilience which our ancestors had encoded for our shared futures, for our shared lifeways. And so the image that I'm sharing here is our community research partner, Norma Ortiz, and she's harvesting yautia, a beautiful purple, very nutritious Indigenous root crop. And I wanted to share that when the forces of wind and water during Hurricane Maria stripped their family farm bare in the community of Sidra in the interior of the island of Boriken, this was the only crop remaining, this Indigenous root crop. And it's often a reminder to us, you know, those stories like that. So today, in our own hands, we are bringing together new ways of knowing and new forms of data, all of which this current and future generations will really need in their tool bundles to guide them through the challenges before us. And as Dr. Kimmer emphasized, we need a kind of science that supports symbiosis among ways of knowing. So it's our original responsibilities to the land, to lifeways, to our data relations, as well, that can guide us in developing this science, something that I appreciate articulating as a relational science, for example. And here I'll just share a few images. These are from our community-based climate research efforts in the Caribbean, where our youth, which are the inherent stewards of Indigenous data, are supported as the researchers, and community knowledge keepers, their grandparents, their abuelos, are also their primary sources of data and learning. to try to continue to strengthen that bond. And for those who are working through similar colonial legacies, working to support Indigenous data sovereignty, we now have numerous resources for guidance, including Indigenous scholarship and methodologies, human rights frameworks, and guidelines developed through collaborative partnerships between Indigenous rights holders and stakeholder organizations and institutions. And I also include always this image of our abuela Indigenous abuela from Cuba here to remind us of the protocols and the guidance that may not be published and written, but which we can only learn through listening and through being in community, as these also remain central to this work. So I'll share really briefly also the work of our Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Research Lab at Colorado State University, where we're working in partnership with the Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance, in which we've gathered 32 Indigenous ethics frameworks from around the world, such as some of the ones in the collage I shared earlier. And we've been identifying key values and principles represented within them, which we're now applying to assess US research standards for federally funded environmental science research. And these core principles include holding cultural responsiveness, grounding in Indigenous worldviews, nurturing reciprocal relationships, honoring rights, maintaining ethics for balance, centering Indigenous governance, and being a good ancestor. And these speak to key responsibilities for accountability and justice on the part of researchers to land, community, to data, honoring our past and caring for our shared futures. So within each of these, we've also identified specific methods and mechanisms for applying these values and principles in practice, which we hope to learn from and apply in future researcher trainings and policy development. And I can drop a link to our project site in the chat, or maybe my collaboratory brother, Andrew, might be able to drop that in the Zoom chat for you all. And through that link, you can also access those 32 Indigenous ethics frameworks if you'd like to explore them. But for now, I'll share two pathways, two mechanisms towards operationalizing Indigenous data governance for Indigenous data sovereignty. With the first being thinking about as the FAIR data principles, which you might be familiar with. They've been gaining ground in the open science, open data movement as they are offered through the GITA Global Organization. We're offering the CARE principles to work complementary to those data principles for Indigenous data governance. And the CARE principles extend principles outlined in FAIR data to include collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics to ensure data guidelines address historical context, such as what I outlined earlier, and justice in terms of power inequity. So the focus then is shifting from solely on data to our relational responsibilities that are connected to that data. And this includes affirmation that Indigenous ethics should inform data use, with Indigenous people's rights and well-being the primary concern at all stages of the data life cycle and across the data ecosystem, for minimizing harm and for maximizing benefit and for justice and for future data use. So another mechanism I'll share for operationalizing Indigenous data sovereignty for those working with data collections and digital repositories, I'll highlight the work of Local Context Community Hub as one additional resource, which has worked with communities to develop traditional knowledge and biocultural metadata labels and notices. And these tools are described by the Hub as practical mechanisms to advance aspirations for Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous innovation. So these tools serve collaborators in numerous ways, including restoring authority to communities regarding who holds provenance interests over data, which customary protocols should be respected in association with data, such as seasonal restrictions or protections of sacred or sensitive knowledge, and permissions regarding what forms of primary and secondary data use have been approved acceptable by the community. So as our data evolve into new digital forms, we need new methods for retaining our value-based and relational contexts that have been associated with that data. And so I offer these examples as a means for centering justice to these data relationships in that way. And I'll share also, if you explore the local context hub, you can access numerous case studies where metadata labels and notices have been applied. And I'll just look briefly at one example from the Skillet's community of the Stolo First Nation, which it has been working in partnership with local contexts. The community is using this partnership to develop traditional knowledge labels, such as this one that you can access through their website. And these labels help to guide web-based interactions and interpretation, such as in this case, guidance regarding outreach. So again, this is our data relations living in new forms, living in digital forms, which are part of our era we're in, our contemporary time we're in, and an example of how we can innovate new methods of data stewardship that support self-determination, both in how it's presented and how people interact with it. So in addition to these examples, there are numerous high-level commitments to Indigenous data sovereignty now spanning the globe, including Aotearoa, New Zealand, US, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Mexico, and Southeast Asia, and also bridges across nation states through international networks that are working collectively. And that brings me to the last resource I'll speak to, one of our greatest resources for supporting Indigenous data sovereignty for our shared futures and lifeways, which is each other. And so many of us are sharing similar experiences, similar historical legacies that I shared with you today, so we can learn from one another in our time together here at Rising Voices and going forward from here on how to navigate this next leg of our journey during this time of increasing change. And I'll leave you in this closing with a question that we can reflect on going forward today, which is, who are your community's Indigenous data stewards? And what are you doing both as an individual and within your respective institutions? What are you doing to support them in this role and to support self-determined futures on behalf of our collective well-being, on behalf of our collective lifeways for our future? And so with that, I'll give my thanks, Hahom and Seneca Kakona, wishing you blessings in your lives and in this work.
Mahalo, Dominique. All I can say is wow. Wow. Such important work, inspiring, but also raises a lot of questions as far as where to, what next? How do we do these things? Because you've been doing this for so long, and many of us have admired what you do, but also understand the amount of work and thought and love that goes into this work. So I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask and see what kind of discussion might follow from this. Is, do you have any examples of collaborations that actually brought together Indigenous knowledges and Western science, in particular, what the role of data sovereignty plays in these collaborations is?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I honestly, every example where you have Indigenous scientists working on or leading these projects is an example of bringing together those ways of knowing. Inherently, we're carrying them inside of us. It's really, I mean, I didn't understand, I didn't know what Indigenous data sovereignty was in that conceptualization in our language until sharing my research at American Geophysical Union in the session that Heather and Julie and many of us, our RV family here, facilitated, when Stephanie and Andrew and our colleagues approached me and said, oh, this is Indigenous data sovereignty work. But it's really, you know, anytime we're restoring that authority and creating pathways to restore that authority for community to decide what questions do we need asked, what data do we need collective that will serve our community interests and needs. Any of those examples are really demonstrating Indigenous data sovereignty. And I think the poster sessions that were shared, the work of so many here, the work of Elena Sparrow and the folks up north working with Globe, for example, that are engaging youth, engaging community in the data collection. These are all examples of those type of collaborations, but it's really, it's not just about forming the team, it's about making sure our youth can still retain their cultural grounding and understandings that they inherently carry while they're learning, you know, physical science or whatever other types of scientific ways of knowing to enhance their skills to answer the questions we need answered and solve the problems we need solved.
In these examples of collaborations, you know, how do considerations and protocols about data sovereignty contribute to this deeper relationship among the partners, as well as deeper understanding of the issues?
I think that it's shifting away from, so long the standard has been, you know, often driven by funding. So we're shaping our research to meet those funding objectives and or the objectives of our institutions, the metrics of our institutions, be it publications, you know, peer-reviewed journal articles, data reports. And so often, a lot of the community members that I work with, for example, they won't receive direct benefit from those types of outputs. So within the data sovereignty movement, it's really shifting the focus of the conceptualization, even in the conceptualization and design of research and data governance, to relationships, including reciprocity within those relationships. So if we're gathering data, or as you remind us, if data is being given to us, what are we giving in return? And what responsibilities do we have to inherit that gift, regardless of what background we're coming from, if we're engaging in that research and data governance or data stewardship? So it's very explicit about the people, the non-human relatives, the inherent rights that they hold, and our responsibilities to upholding those rights. And then the relationships are what make it strong and make it last the test of time. I think the panelists too should speak to that question, because there's a lot of folks joining after me that have that on the ground experience in this work too. So I hope they can chime in.
I do think the panel will have a lot of follow-up to this. Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions to ask of Dominique, you know, please you know, put it in the Slido page. Oh, here they are.
Okay.
Okay, first question from Katie Spellman is, how do you think the two A's in the fair, accessible, and care, authority to control, work together, especially with the environment for open data archiving in most federally funded projects? And do you have any good examples of where where these both are done well?
This would be such a good question for my mentor, Dr. Stephanie Russo Carroll, who's been working more closely with and who was core in developing the CARE principles. I know now we're in the process of building the criteria now for applying the CARE principles, for example, in environmental information and data science. So she's really at the cusp of that work. But I think that we have seen the effects of data about our community being decontextualized, being accessed and applied any which way. Like I said earlier, without love, without accountability, without responsibility, and without relationships. And so now thinking about there's a time and place where certain knowledge and data and information should be shared to retain that context. So these tools, some of the tools in which to also operationalize the CARE principles are tools such as those traditional knowledge metadata labels, which define which data should be open access and what might be secret or sacred knowledge or should be shared within a certain context, within a certain time of year or certain type of space. So that's they're working complementary by adding more depth around when and where and by whom data should be accessed. And another area to look at would be OCAP principles from First Nations governance centers in Canada that have also been able to articulate principles and protocols around data access. But yeah, as far as specific examples, I think we should turn to Stephanie.
Great. Carlotta has a question, Carlotta Chief, and how do we educate academia about data sovereignty? Okay. And what are the best practices to ensure data sovereignty with academics who are not in our circles to prevent helicopter research?
Yeah, I like this question, and I'm engaged in this process right now. And I think it's a combination of anti-shaming and peer pressure and honoring. Really, we need to bring back some of our traditional systems around shaming and honoring, holding up those projects that are exercising Indigenous data sovereignty as model methods, as model projects in this work. And also one thing that I'm excited to see now are codified protocols, codified policy for research that are including this. So IATSIS, one of the ones in the collage, these are now a code of ethics for research in Australia with Aboriginal and Torres Island people. The CARE principles are now codified and should be moving into a mandate for all research in Australia towards the end of the year for any research engaging those Aboriginal and Torres Island communities to enact the CARE principles as part of that research. Now I've had a few research proposals where in the RFP, in the call for proposals, I've seen criteria where you need to write about how you're going to ensure Indigenous data sovereignty in your data management and in your research design. So I think some of it's, building it into the infrastructure, and some of it's that anti-shaming and honoring that we could, bring back. It takes some time for it to become part of the common language and translate, but through gatherings such as this where we're centering our conversation, it's going to help us to be able to articulate a language of sovereignty rather than this deficit vulnerability narrative we're so often subjected to. I think it's a way we can flip the script. Thanks for your question, Carletta, and for your work too.
Reminder, folks, we have a few questions about seeing the slides again. I think everybody appreciated not just the artwork of your slides as you introduce it, but also the information in there. And this has been being recorded, so you can go back and take a look at them. We have one more question, I think, that we'll do. And can you talk about the challenges of working these ways within an academic context, especially with students and faculty and community, and the ways you found best in addressing them?
Yeah, I'll speak first to the challenges and then we'll end on the high note. I think we're in a really amazing time because there is this increasing push for Indigenous engagement, especially Indigenous knowledges. The way that the peoples who hold that knowledge are engaged is interesting. I mean, I work in a predominantly white institution, so I'm speaking from that experience, which may be very different than a tribal college or university or, tribal organization, for example. But here, the default, it seems, is tokenizing. It's still folks designing the research and determining the questions and kind of coming in with a savior vibe, and then reaching out, realizing, oh, I need some Indigenous folks on this project. That's still a lot of what I'm experiencing and my colleagues are experiencing. I think that a lot of the work is well-intentioned. It's just the pieces we've been missing in our training, for example, around relationships, the pieces of historical context that have been missing from so many of our peers' education, where they don't know that Native history is US history and how colonization has been a part of that, like I shared, and continues to be. So how we need to dismantle that to be able to speak to each other openly. And there's just a lot of awkwardness taking place around that. It's hard even to articulate. The amazing ways that we've been able to overcome it are really through these Indigenous-led networks and teams where folks are willing to paddle in the canoe, but not trying to steer or put us in a whole different boat. And like folks are willing to support through grant writing and listen and see where their skills and capacity fit in, and not bringing the Indigenous scholars and partners on sort of as an afterthought. And I'm the first generation in my family with access to higher education, the first one reading the government reports and data about our communities, just in shock, wondering what we do now. And we've been trickling in for a while now, trickling into not just academia, but into leadership roles and policy and governance, environmental leadership, just trickling in. But there's this whole wave now coming behind us. I can see them coming, and really just, reinforcing the pathways for this generation coming in of culturally grounded scholars that are carrying these different ways of knowing just seamlessly, just gracefully in their being, because they have to. If we can reinforce those pathways and provide them all these different tools for their bundles that we can offer from our respective experience, and just let them go forward and lead, that's really the way that I've seen us overcoming that challenge. And I think, something we can definitely continue to do.
Well, how about Dominique, especially that that last part is because it shows some of the continuity between what has been spoken of and referred to over the past week and your growing and maturing of leaders.
Yeah.
With the ways, with the knowledge behind you.
We have a PhD position open, so at our Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Lab. So if some of you are ready to take that next step, reach out to Hahom Thank you for your questions. Good questions.
Yes, mahalo, Dominique. Mahalo for everyone who posed questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to address all of them, but we do have a great follow-up with the upcoming panel.